The quantum lift doors of the Galactic Academy's administrative wing slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sight that made the gathered alien students pause their conversations and stare. A human. Not just any human. A small, unimposing female who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the vast cosmos than here. "Oh, fantastic," muttered Zexalar, his crystalline antennae vibrating with disdain. "They're letting primitives into the academy now." His exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial sunlight as he turned to his friend Naira, whose 6 eyes blinked in synchronized disgust. The new arrival wore the standard cadet uniform, a sleek midnight blue jumpsuit with the academy's silver insignia, but on her slight frame, it somehow looked wrong, like a quantum computer being operated by a Stone Age savage. At least, that's what the watching students thought. Commander Vexathor, his scales shifting through shades of diplomatic green, gestured to the human. "Class, this is our new transfer student from Earth. She'll be joining Advanced Combat Theory and Xenopolitical Relations." His tail twitched slightly, the only sign of his own reservations about this unusual addition to his student body. The human gave a small nod, keeping her eyes down. She was almost painfully average-looking by human standards, medium height, unremarkable brown hair pulled back in a simple style, no visible augmentations or enhancements like most spacefaring humans wore. The only notable feature was a slight limp in her left leg, which made several students snicker behind their appendages. "Seems the humans are really scraping the bottom of the gravity well," whispered Crix, his membrane-thin wings buzzing with amusement. The swarm-born student's comment earned several chittering laughs from his classmates. As the human took her assigned seat, the massive Urgoth student next to her shifted his bulk as far away as possible, nearly crushing the poor Zenthi on his other side. No one wanted to be too close to the primitive new arrival. "Now then," Commander Vexathor continued, his scales settling into a professional blue-grey, "we were discussing the Battle of Proxima Centauri and its impact on modern fleet tactics. Can anyone tell me the key strategic error that led to the Confederacy's defeat?" Several appendages shot up, eager to demonstrate their superior knowledge. The human kept her head down, seemingly absorbed in taking notes on her archaic paper tablet, another sign of her backwards nature, according to the smirking students around her. "Yes, Naira," Vexathor acknowledged. The arachnid student preened, her mandibles clicking with confidence. "The Confederacy failed to account for human unpredictability. They assumed their superior technology would guarantee victory and underestimated humanity's capacity for—" She paused, glancing smugly at the new student. "Primitive violence." More snickers rippled through the classroom. The human's only reaction was to press her stylus a bit harder against her paper. "A simplistic analysis," Vexathor responded, his scales flickering briefly to disappointed orange. "Anyone else?" The human's hand rose slowly, surprising everyone. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but clear. "The Confederacy's fatal error was assuming that bigger ships meant better ships. They concentrated their forces in massive dreadnoughts, making them perfect targets for the smaller, more maneuverable human vessels. Superior technology means nothing if you can't bring it to bear effectively." The silence that followed was deafening. Naira's mandibles clicked in irritation while Zexlar's antennae vibrated with barely suppressed outrage at being schooled by a primitive. "Precisely correct," Vexathor said, his scales brightening to please purple. "The human fleet's distributed attack pattern was ultimately successful because—" But the rest of his lecture was lost on most students, who were too busy shooting venomous looks at the quiet human in their midst. How dare she show them up? Who did this limping primitive think she was? The human just kept taking notes, seemingly oblivious to the hostile attention. But if anyone had been watching very closely, they might have noticed the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Just for a moment, the Academy had no idea what they were in for. "Remember, accuracy matters more than speed," Professor Kazeth announced to the assembled students in the combat simulation chamber. His gelatinous form rippled with instructional patterns. "Your target may have multiple vital organs in unexpected locations." The new human had been at the Academy for 3 weeks now, and the novelty of mocking her had yet to wear off. She stood at the back of the group, datapad clutched to her chest like a shield, that ever-present limp making her look even more out of place among the various alien species. "Watch this," Zexlar whispered to his growing circle of anti-human supporters. He stepped up to the holographic targeting range, his crystalline form glinting as he took position. With lightning-fast movements, he nailed every target dead center. The display board showed 98% accuracy. "Excellent form," Professor Kazeth burbled approvingly. "Who's next?" "Why not our primitive friend?" Naira suggested, all six eyes glittering with malice. "Surely she wants to show us those famous human combat skills we keep hearing about." The human hesitated, then limped forward. She picked up the training weapon awkwardly, as if she'd never held one before. Her first shot went wide, making several students laugh. The second barely clipped the target's edge. "Perhaps we should adjust the difficulty level," Professor Kazeth offered kindly, "for those less experienced." "No need," the human said quietly, finishing her embarrassing attempt with a score of 43%. She limped back to her place, ignoring the barely concealed sniggers. During physical training it was even worse. The anti-grav obstacle course was particularly brutal. While the Urgoth student bulldozed through with raw power and Nira gracefully swung through on her silk lines, the human struggled visibly. That limp became more pronounced as she laboriously made her way through the course, coming in dead last. "Ancestors, it's painful to watch," Crix buzzed, his wings vibrating with mock sympathy. "Should we request a special remedial class for her?" The human just kept to herself, eating alone in the cafeteria, always choosing seats near exits. Her combat theory essays were adequate but unremarkable. In tactical simulations, she made obvious mistakes that even first-year cadets would avoid. But something about her continued to irritate her classmates. Perhaps it was the way she seemed completely unbothered by their mockery, or how her quiet answers in class, while never brilliant, showed just enough understanding to pass. "I heard humans were supposed to be this great warrior species," Zexlar complained during one particularly brutal training session. "The terror of the galaxy. Look at this one. Can barely keep up with basic drills." The human was struggling with a simple hand-to-hand combat exercise against a training drone set to novice level. Her movements were clumsy, uncoordinated. When she fell, Nera's mandibles clicked with vicious amusement. "Maybe she's defective," the arachnid suggested loudly. "Some kind of rejected specimen?" Yet occasionally there were moments, like when a training drone malfunctioned and came at Crix too fast. The human had shifted slightly, as if preparing to move, before catching herself and staying still. Or during tactical discussions when her eyes would track the movement of holographic fleet formations with just a bit too much understanding. Commander Vexathor noticed too. His scales would sometimes shift to curious purple when observing her deliberately poor performance. During one particularly heated class debate about the Battle of Rigel IV, he caught her biting back words, her fingers twitching as if stopping themselves from pointing out something on the tactical display. "I don't care what anyone says," Zexlar declared after watching her botch another simple exercise. "Humans are the most overrated species in the galaxy. All those stories about their military prowess, propaganda. Look at this specimen, we could probably break her with one appendage." The human just ducked her head and limped away, clutching her datapad like always, but for just a split second, Naira could have sworn she saw something in those dull human eyes, something that made all six of her eyes blink rapidly in momentary uncertainty. The tension continued to build. Small accidents began happening. Training drones mysteriously set to higher difficulties when the human used them, her datapad going missing before important tests, occasional shoves in crowded corridors. Through it all, she remained frustratingly passive, almost too passive, as if she were waiting. "I don't like it," Naira admitted privately to Zexlar one day. "No human should be this tolerant of disrespect. It's not natural for their species." "Are you actually worried about the limping primitive?" Zexlar's antennae vibrated with derision. "Please, she's nothing. Probably only got in through some diversity initiative." But that night, as the human limped her way back to her quarters, she passed a holo display showing news from the ongoing border conflicts. For just a moment, her reflection in the screen showed a different person. Back straight, eyes sharp, every movement precise and controlled. Then she noticed Crix watching from around the corner, and the illusion shattered. The limping, unremarkable human returned, shuffling away into the darkness. The act was perfect, almost too perfect. The Academy's annual crisis response exercise was a big deal. Every student knew their performance could make or break their future careers. The massive simulation chamber hummed with nervous energy, as Commander Vexthor addressed the assembled class. "Today's scenario is classified as Omega level," he announced, scales shifting to Sirius Grey. "You'll be facing a coordinated multi-vector assault on a civilian space station. Teams have been randomly assigned." The human ended up with Zexala and Naira, much to their vocal displeasure. "Just stay out of our way, primitive," Zexala hissed. "Try not to get any civilians killed in the simulation." The simulation began. Holographic attackers swarmed the station while civilian NPCs panicked and ran. Zexala and Naira moved with practiced efficiency, their superior alien reflexes making short work of the first wave. Then everything went sideways. "Alert! Reactor breach detected. Containment failing." The station's AI blared warnings as radiation levels spiked in the simulation. Holographic civilians screamed and fled toward the escape pods. "We need to evacuate the civilian deck," Naira clicked, her mandibles twitching with stress. "No," the human said quietly. "It's a trap." "Shut up, primitive. What would you know?" Zexala's crystalline form vibrated with anger as he headed for the civilian deck. "The reactor readings are wrong," the human continued, still quiet but with an edge of authority that made both aliens pause. "Look at the power fluctuations. This isn't a reactor breach. It's a false signal to herd civilians into killing zones." Commander Vexthor, monitoring from the control room, leaned forward with sudden interest. His scales rippled with thoughtful blue. Before either alien could respond, a new wave of attackers burst from the civilian evacuation routes, exactly where the panicking NPCs would have been running. "How did you—" Naira began, all six eyes widening. But the human was already moving. Gone was the limp, gone was the awkwardness. She flowed through the holographic attackers like water, each movement precise and economical. When a simulated grenade arced toward their position, she snatched it from the air and threw it back in one smooth motion, taking out an entire enemy squad. "That's impossible," Zexala whispered, his antennae vibrating in disbelief. Then, just as quickly, the human seemed to remember herself. She stumbled, forced the limp back into her stride, and deliberately missed her next few shots. But Commander Vexthor had seen enough. His scales shifted rapidly through shades of realization as he accessed his secure terminal, checking something in restricted military files. The rest of the simulation passed in a blur of awkward movements and poor shooting from the human, but her teammates couldn't forget what they'd seen. Those few seconds of precise, lethal grace haunted them. "How did you know about the reactor trap?" Naira demanded afterward, her mandibles clicking nervously. "Lucky guess," the human mumbled, back to clutching her datapad and avoiding eye contact. "I read something similar in a history text once." "No," Zexala said slowly, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns of suspicion. "That was more than book knowledge. Those movements—" But the human had already limped away, leaving her teammates to stare after her with new uncertainty. In his office, Commander Vexthor was having an encrypted communication with Galactic Military Command. His scales kept shifting between shocked white and thoughtful blue as he reviewed heavily classified combat footage from the border wars. The footage showed a legendary human commander leading an impossible defense of the Arcturus line. The image was blurry, but the way she moved— He closed the file quickly when he heard footsteps approaching his office. The human student limped in, responding to his summons. "Interesting performance today," he said carefully, scales rippling with controlled curiosity. "I got lucky, sir," she responded, eyes downcast. But there was something in her stance now, a weight, a presence she usually kept hidden. "Indeed," he let his scales shift to knowing purple. "You know, I was at Arcturus, Medical Support Division, never saw the fighting directly, but I heard stories." For just a moment her eyes met his. In them he saw knowledge of battles that had become legend, of victories that had shaped the galaxy. Then she blinked, and was once again just an unremarkable human student. "Will that be all, sir?" she asked quietly. Commander Vexthor nodded slowly, his scales settling into respectful deep blue. "Carry on, student." As she limped away, he wondered how many others would figure it out before she chose to reveal herself, and what would happen when she did. The attack came during third rotation. No warning, no demands, just the sudden wail of actual emergency sirens and the stomach-dropping sensation of the Academy's artificial gravity fluctuating. "This isn't a drill," Commander Vexthor announced over the emergency channels, his scales visibly grey with concern on the holographic display. "Unknown hostile forces have breached the outer defensive perimeter. All students report to secure locations immediately. The human was in the library with Naira and several other students when the first explosion rocked the building. Real explosions felt different from training simulations. They carried the acrid smell of genuine fear. "We need to get to the security bunkers," Crix buzzed, his wings vibrating with panic, "before they breach the inner walls." Another explosion, closer this time. The library's reinforced windows cracked under the pressure wave. Through them they could see unfamiliar ships strafing the Academy's defensive turrets. "Those are Blackwing Raiders," Zexlar said, his crystalline form clouding with fear. "They never leave survivors." The human stood very still, watching the battle outside. Something was changing in her posture, a straightening of the spine, a shift in balance. The transformation was subtle but profound, like a weapon being uncased. "The main corridors will be death traps," she said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of command. "They'll have teams inside by now watching evacuation routes." Nira's mandibles clicked rapidly. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because it's what I would do." The human's eyes swept the room, cataloguing exits and resources. Gone was the hesitant student, replaced by something that made the alien's instincts scream danger. "We need to move, now!" Before anyone could argue, the library doors exploded inward. Black armored figures swarmed through the smoke, weapons raised. Several students screamed. The human was already moving. With horrible efficiency, she overturned a heavy study table for cover, pulling a frozen Zenthi student behind it, just as plasma bolts scorched the air where they'd been standing. "Stay down," she ordered, her voice carrying the weight of battlefields none of them had seen. "When I give the signal, run for the maintenance shaft behind the historical archives. Single file, no stopping." "Why should we listen to you?" Zexlar demanded, but his defiance sounded hollow. The human ignored him, her eyes fixed on the raiders' movements. "They're using standard Blackwing assault patterns, 3-man teams overlapping fields of fire, just like at Praxis 9. "How do you know about Praxis 9? Nira whispered. "That operation was classified." Another explosion cut her off. Through the chaos they heard the raiders coordinating their advance in harsh, guttural voices. The human reached down and did something to her left leg, the one with the limp. There was a soft click, and what looked like medical cybernetics deactivated. When she straightened, there was no trace of the limp that had marked her presence at the academy. "Because I was there," she said simply, and for the first time the gathered students saw her clearly. The way she held herself, the careful economy of movement, the eyes that had seen 1,000 battles. This was no ordinary cadet. Terror and recognition warred in Nira's expression. "You're—" "Later," the human cut her off. "Right now we need to move. Stay close, do exactly as I say, and we might survive this." A plasma bolt struck their cover, melting a hole through the reinforced material. The human didn't even flinch. She was scanning the room, running calculations no civilian should know how to make. "Zexlar, I need your crystalline refraction ability. Create a light scatter on my mark. Naira, your silk can handle the heat of those plasma weapons. I need strings across their advance route, ankle height. Crix, those wings can generate enough ultrasonic disturbance to disorient their motion sensors." The alien stared at her, years of dismissive superiority crumbling in the face of absolute battlefield authority. "Unless you'd prefer to die here," she added mildly. Another explosion rocked the library. Beyond the smoke, they could hear the screams of other students being rounded up. "Who are you?" Crix whispered. The human checked the structural integrity of a nearby wall with practiced eyes. "Right now, I'm the only chance you have of getting out of here alive. Ready?" They nodded, all previous prejudices forgotten in the face of survival. "On my mark," she said, and in her voice was the weight of victories that had become legend, of battles that had shaped the fate of worlds. The hesitant transfer student was gone, burned away like morning fog in the harsh light of combat. What remained was something far more dangerous, and the raiders had no idea what they'd just walked into. The human's eyes hardened with familiar determination. Another explosion illuminated the library, casting harsh shadows across her face. In that moment, she looked exactly like the classified combat footage Commander Vexathor had been reviewing, a nightmare from the Blackwing's past, come back to haunt them. "Now," she said quietly, "let me show you why humans have a reputation for warfare." The next few minutes were a masterclass in human warfare. The raiders never stood a chance. She moved like a ghost through their formations, each strike precise and devastating. Zexlar's light scatter provided cover, while Naira's silk thread sent armored raiders crashing down. The human flowed between them, disabling weapons, breaking bones, moving with the terrible grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Command, this is Strike Leader," one raider managed to transmit. "The human from Arcturus, she's he—" His message cut off as she separated him from consciousness with clinical efficiency. The remaining students watched in stunned silence. This was nothing like the clumsy cadet they'd mocked. This was poetry written in violence, a symphony of calculated destruction. Through the library's broken windows, they could see more raiders rappelling down from hovering assault ships. The human assessed the situation with a single glance. "Third drop pattern," she muttered, "just like New Constantinople." She turned to the awestruck aliens. "Stay behind me and run exactly where I run. Understood?" They nodded mutely. Even Zexler, who had been the most vocal in his disdain, looked like his entire worldview was being reorganized. They fought their way through the Academy's corridors, or rather, she fought while they followed, watching as she systematically dismantled every threat they encountered. Years of combat experience were evident in every movement. When a raider got too close to Naira, the human's response was so fast it seemed to break physics. "Impossible," Crix whispered after watching her take down 3 armored attackers in as many seconds. "The strength requirements alone." "Genetic enhancement," she explained between breaths, not even winded. "Standard issue for Arcturus veterans, thought the limp would help hide it." The revelation hit Naira like a physical blow. "Arcturus, but that means you're—" "The Ghost of Arcturus line," a new voice finished. Commander Vexathor emerged from a secure doorway, his scales bright with recognition and respect. The human commander who held back an entire Blackwing assault fleet with nothing but a damaged destroyer and sheer tactical brilliance. The human shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "The crews did the real work. I just pointed them in the right direction." "You destroyed 37 capital ships," Vexathor continued, his scales rippling with awe. "Rewrote every tactical manual in the galaxy. They said you retired after taking a plasma bolt to the leg." "Needed time to think," she admitted, checking sightlines with professional paranoia. "Thought teaching might help, until these idiots showed up." She gestured at the unconscious raiders. Zexlar's crystalline form was practically vibrating with shock. But you let us mock you, called you primitive, for weeks." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Needed to maintain cover. Besides, your tactical assumptions were educational, revealing how much the galaxy still underestimates humanity." More explosions rocked the building. The human's expression hardened again. "Command center," she asked Vexathor. His scales shifted to grim grey. "Taken. They have hostages." Not for long. She turned to the students who had tormented her for weeks. "Want to see why humans are considered one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy?" What followed was a lesson none of them would ever forget. They watched as she orchestrated a counter-assault that seemed to break every rule of conventional warfare. Using nothing but the Academy's basic security systems and the abilities of her former tormentors, she systematically dismantled the entire raider operation. Naira's silk became tripwires and repelling lines. Zexala's crystalline properties created laser-refracting defensive screens. Even Crix's ultrasonic abilities were weaponized in ways he'd never imagined possible. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the raiders captured, the hostages freed, and the legendary Ghost of Arcturus calmly explaining tactical theory to a group of shell-shocked students. "The key," she was saying, "is understanding that superior technology means nothing without superior tactics. Your assumptions about human warfare were technically correct but fundamentally wrong. We're not dangerous because we're stronger or faster, we're dangerous because we never stop learning, adapting, improving." The assembled alien students, who hours ago had sneered at her supposed weakness, listened with rapt attention. The disdain in their eyes had been replaced by something approaching awe. As medical teams treated the injured and military officials debriefed the survivors, Naira approached her former target. "Why come here?" the arachnid asked. "Why put up with our behavior when you could have been commanding fleets?" The human looked thoughtful. "Sometimes the best way to change minds isn't through force. Sometimes you have to let people discover their own misconceptions." She smiled slightly. "Though I admit, the looks on your faces when the truth came out made all those weeks of clumsy acting worth it." Zexlar's antennae drooped with embarrassment. We were fools. No, she corrected, you were learning, and if today taught you anything about assumptions and prejudice, then maybe I managed to teach something after all. The gathered aliens watched as she limped away. The injury was real, though nowhere near as debilitating as she'd pretended, to report to the arriving military brass. In her wake, she left a group of students who would never again underestimate a human, limping or otherwise. The academy changed after the Blackwing incident. Gone were the sneers, the whispered insults about primitive species. When the human limped into class, now with a real combat injury, rather than a pretended one, students straightened in their seats. The thing about legends, Commander Vexathor said during one particularly memorable lecture, his scales shifting through thoughtful shades of blue, is that they rarely match our preconceptions. We imagine grand gestures and obvious power when true strength often comes disguised in humility. The human had resumed her quiet note-taking in the back row, but now everyone understood it was by choice rather than weakness. Sometimes during tactical discussions, she would offer small insights that left even the instructors speechless. Naira found her in the library one evening, poring over historical texts. There's something I don't understand, the arachnid said, mandibles clicking nervously. You're qualified to teach this entire course. Why sit through our basic lessons? The human looked up with that slight knowing smile that had once infuriated them. Because the best commanders never stop learning. Even wrong answers can teach you something new. Zexlar and Crix joined them, their former hostility replaced by burning curiosity. Is it true what they say? Crix buzzed. About New Constantinople? Most of it's classified, she replied. But let's just say humans have a gift for turning disadvantages into advantages. Like pretending to be a struggling cadet when you're actually a legendary commander. Zexlar's crystalline form sparkled with newfound respect. She shrugged. The academy needed a lesson it couldn't learn from textbooks about assumptions, prejudice, and the danger of underestimating any species. Her eyes twinkled. Consider it a practical exam. The truth came out a week later during a special assembly. The Academy's board of directors announced a major curriculum change, the introduction of new courses on interspecies relations and the dangers of xenophobic prejudice. Recent events, the Chancellor declared, have highlighted serious flaws in our institutional culture. Thanks to the recommendations of a certain decorated human commander who graciously agreed to evaluate our programs undercover, we will be implementing sweeping changes. The assembled students turned to stare at their former classmate, who sat quietly in her usual back row seat. That was your real mission, Naira realized, not recovery or teaching, but assessment. Humanity's greatest weapon has always been adaptation, the human explained. But the galaxy can't move forward if its best military academy is teaching outdated prejudices. Sometimes the best way to change a system is from within. The changes extended beyond the academy. News of how a single human had protected the galaxy's most prestigious military school spread rapidly. Other institutions began re-evaluating their own policies and biases. On her last day before returning to active duty, she left a note for her former tormentors. True strength isn't about physical power or advanced technology. It's about understanding yourself, your assumptions, and especially those you consider inferior. The galaxy is too vast for prejudice. Remember that the next time you meet someone who seems weak, they might just be teaching you the most important lesson of your life. Commander Vexathor found her packing up her quarters. His scales shifted to curious purple. Was it worth it, all those weeks of pretense? She smiled, tucking a combat medal into her bag, one that none of them had known she carried. The best victories are the ones that change minds, not just battlefields. As she limped out of the academy one final time, she passed a new group of cadets. Humans, aliens, all species mixed together without the old tensions. One of them held the door for her, not seeing a legendary commander, just someone who needed a little help. She smiled. Mission accomplished. Sometimes the quietest revolutions were the most effective, and sometimes the greatest lessons came not from battlefield glory, but from a simple willingness to be underestimated. The galaxy would remember the Battle of the Academy for years to come, but its most important legacy wasn't the combat prowess displayed that day. It was the lesson taught by a limping human who proved that true strength often came in unexpected packages. And somewhere in deep space, a decorated commander smiled, already planning her next undercover mission. After all, there were plenty of other institutions that needed similar lessons. The galaxy was changing one prejudice at a time.